Hello and welcome back. This is, of course, the fifth session of our public seminar of the chair of geopolitics in risk, ethics of uncertainty, which is the theme of the year. This session is dedicated to the question of the aftermath of the Utøya Oslo attacks in 2011 with guests Witsø, Rafoss, and Heath-Kelly. I am in a place whom I'll introduce in detail in a moment. I am in a place tonight which has very bad internet, but the main event is that the two guests are not. So whatever happens to me, we'll be able to carry on with them. Vous vous en doutez, la séance se passera en anglais, donc faute de norvégien. Si vous avez éventuellement des questions, des commentaires après, vous pouvez bien entendu les poser en français et on peut les traduire de suite. First, as usual, a little look back at what we discussed last week while I let people in one after another. Last week, it was a question of the relationship between insecurity, crisis, and climate change. An innovation or the novelty of the session came through the discussion of the concept, well, two concepts, really. One of climatization, modeled after securitization, which we've talked about before. So it's not, as you would think in the French language, something about air conditioning. Climatization, so rendering things into discourse of climate change, or again the concept of environmentalization. These were both used by the speakers last week to describe the processes they saw in the way that climate change became a security threat and became instrumentalized through United Nations institutions. So we're talking about the ambient qualities of the discourse of climate change, the way the discourse works in order to change institutional priorities, the way it works to change what legitimate speech is, and so on and so forth. Again, very much modeled after the theory of securitization, which we've talked much about. So how does temperature change, flooding, storms, etc., become security issues for a variety of different institutions? And of course, it's different adaptations of these problems depending on which institution we're talking about. We focused a lot on the United Nations Security Council, but we also named questions of private corporations or other international and national organizations. And we discussed a number of hypotheses about what this acclimatization could mean. Is it an international state of exception, state of emergency? Does it follow a certain strategy? Is there a certain evolution that it follows? Is there a way that it's applied which cannot be applied, in which other discourses cannot be applied? How is climatization used, instrumentalized? And how is it transformed horizontally into different kinds of power? And how does it evolve? How does it apply itself? How is it transferred? And then towards the end of the session, particularly in the talk of Adrien Esteve, we talked about the possible avenues of critique of this discourse. How can we resist it? How can we critique the discourse of climatization or environmentalization? When should we, and how can we? And how has this tendency, these possibilities been applied by different organizations and individuals to the analysis of thought in international relations? In particular, of course, Lucille Martins was interested in the United Nations Security Council resolutions and the way they formulate and then use the constellation of security and climate change. So that was the discussion last week. This week we turned our attention to something completely different. Not only a very different case, but a very different orientation towards the case. because this time, instead of talking about the future, to put it very, very simply, we're going to talk about the past. So the current concepts and arguments we've developed in the seminar so far have been oriented toward future dangers, dangers that have not yet taken form, dangers that are still potential, still possible, but uncertain. So this concept of uncertainty that's so central in the seminar this year is one about the uncertainty of the future. We don't know what's coming, and we see that in addition to the actual danger that risks imply, things get broken, people get hurt or killed. The uncertainty carries with it a kind of moral danger. That's why we call it ethics of uncertainty, a kind of moral danger linked to uncertainty itself. The fact that we do not know holds a certain kind of danger in itself. So uncertainty is itself experienced as a danger. And then we can ask a danger to what? To society, to our customs, and to society's values. What happens when we don't know what's coming? Are we equally good citizens, good members of society, as we would be if we did know what was coming? That kind of question can be posed. But this evening, we're going to talk about the retrospective case of Utøya and Oslo, and talk more about how, let's call it unresolved memories of the catastrophe generate a kind of new kind of uncertainty, a new field of uncertainty, and through it a new field of social unease, tensions, politics, cultural quarrels, and even battles. So the uncertainty or the inability to decide how to understand the past and the debates around it create a new kind of uncertainty going forward. So instead of asking what dangerous event might take place in the future, we're left asking the question, which might seem obvious to some, but it's not obvious at all. What kind of dangerous thing actually did take place in the past? What was it that happened? And what does it mean for us? And how can we then increase improve our security standards? How can we memorialize it? How can we understand the evolution of the nation state in relation to it? So on the one hand, the narrative of the past event and the very high stakes that it involves becomes unclear and uncertain in unpredictable ways. So there's a new sort of layer of uncertainty. And on the other hand, the trauma of the catastrophic event creates a new kind of psychopathology, if you like, a source of a different kind of uncertainty, of memory. We don't remember entirely. It's confusing what happened. There's debate about it. Does this mean that we're actually vulnerable in who we are, in our identities, in our sense of self, and in the security of ourselves? So the questions of psychic health, social health, to put it that way, and well-being, and so on. So how can an event that was so distinct, was so obviously something that happened very, very clearly, partially on camera, partially documented immediately after the fact, how can something that was so distinct and punctuated in time so clearly and decisively, a matter of history, how could it become the force, the instability that it has become? And this is, I would say, and we can ask our guests what they would answer, but I would say this is not particular to the Norwegian case, but it's a general characteristic of catastrophes. They're absolutely unforgettable, and then they become forgotten. I mean, not entirely forgotten, of course, but they become blurry. So this might be particularly interesting for Professor Heath-Kelly, who's made a number of comparative studies about these kinds of matters. So with that, let me introduce our speakers. I could start with Witsø Rafoss, who holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Oslo and is a researcher at the Institute for Church, Religion and Worldview Research, KIFO as it's called, in Oslo. He has, if you noticed in the Dropbox, the articles that he has published, he studied in detail the attacks that we're talking about tonight from July 22nd, let's get the date right, from a cultural sociological point of view, with a primary interest on how media, public leaders, and the public reacted to the events. especially immediately in the first period after the events. So his approach is through what he calls meaning-centered theories, which he uses to try to understand how Norway reacted to the attacks and how we can then collectively try to give meaning to what happened. So, and he focuses in particular on national identity, and that'll be interesting to talk about this evening. National identity, how it evolved, how it was shaped, how rituals of identity became concrete, what metaphors, what notions of nation are used, including how the nation state is conceptualized in time as a matter of the evolution of the memory of the event. And we can look forward to a forthcoming book on exactly these questions. And some of his more recent publications, just to name three of them: To Feel Community with Foreigners, The Rose Demonstration, and The Sociology of Feelings, which is in Norwegian, in the Norwegian Sociological Journal. Or in English, Enemies of Freedom and Defenders of Democracy, The Metaphorical Response to Terrorism, in Sociologica. And Soldiers Without a War, ? Public and Private Framings of Norway's Engagement in Afghanistan, also in Acta Sociologica. Professor Charlotte Heath-Kelly is Professor of International Security at University of Warwick in the UK. She has studied in depth the memorialization of terrorist attacks, several, as I say, comparatively, but among these, quite in depth, the attacks in Norway in 2011. And indeed, her most recent book explores the sudden surge in building post-terrorist memorials in the post-9/11 era in Norway, United States, Spain, Bali, and the UK. And in this work, she presents memorials as social and architectural projects which can bring resilience and unity to a nation disrupted by terrorism, or so it might seem, if you follow my hypothesis from a moment ago. So she shows in this work how memorials are frequently experience a significant protest from bereaved families. It's certainly the case in the Norway case, from families, local residents, and even conspiracy theorists who don't like the version of the memory that's being provided by the memorial. And in other cases, the memorials, according to Professor Heath-Kelly, just fall into disrepair or disappear. In addition to several articles on the Norwegian case, and I really invite you to consult her bibliography, and you can check out the articles I put in the Dropbox. She's published widely on the meeting place in general between culture, memory, terrorism, and most recently, just to name three, articles: A Moral Education, British Values, Colorblindness, and Preventing Terrorism, recently published in Critical Social Policy. Rituals of World Politics on Visual Practices Disordering Things, co-authored in the Critical Studies on Security journal. The Political Use of Victimhood, Spanish Collective Memory of ETA through the War on Terror Paradigm, also co-authored, published in the Review of International Studies. And then the wonderful book, which I recommend to you all, called Death and Security, Memory and Mortality at the Bomb Site, from Manchester University Press, which has been quite an inspiration for me. The evening is special for me because I've done a lot of work on this myself, and I'm soon to be publishing a book on it as well. So I'll be listening carefully and asking some questions, and I invite you to do the same. As usual, we've decided that the speakers will have approximately 30 minutes each to speak, and after that, there'll be time for discussion between us, your comments and questions and objections, if you like. So I'll start by giving the floor to Rafoss.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you so much for your introduction. I'm glad to be invited to speak. I'm speaking from Oslo. And I don't speak French, so I apologize for that. And I also speak, as you can tell, with a Norwegian accent. So that's how it is. So we just have to relate to that. But I hope you can hear and see me from France and other places. I will speak for about half an hour. And I will talk, as you've already been told, about this terrorist attack in Norway 10 years ago, because Norway is at the outskirts of Europe, and because it's a long time ago, I will remind you a bit about the events before I start trying to give you some theoretical perspectives on what happened. 10 years ago, 22nd of July 2011, it was the public holiday in Norway, quite relaxed day, and then suddenly a big, enormous bomb went off in the middle of Oslo, quite close to in fact. This was, of course, completely unexpected. Norway is quite small, at least population-wise, and a comparatively peaceful country, has been very sheltered, has had both in the present day and historically been a peaceful country with not a lot of wars, conflicts, massacres, that kind of things that you often find in other countries, and also not any big violent attacks of any kind since the Second World War. So this bomb attack was completely unexpected, but what was even more unexpected was what happened, because this attack was done by a single man called Anders Breivik, who was a right-wing anti-Muslim, had an anti-Muslim ideology, but he didn't attack Muslims. He attacked the main government building in Norway. It's a quite big building with the office of the Prime Minister at the top. So because he wanted to attack the government, he attacked this building with a bomb. But he didn't stop there. He took his car and went all the way on the outskirts of Oslo, and he went on a boat, and he came to this small island called Utøya. And in Norway, the historically biggest party, and the party that is in government now, and that was also in government in 2011, is the Labour Party, the center-left Labour Party. And they have a youth organization called AUF, Youth Organization of the Labour Party, and they have a summer camp on this island. The island is owned by this party. It's a medium-sized island. So this is a summer camp, and it's a political youth party, so there's a lot of young people. And terrorist Breivik was disguised as a policeman, had a fake police uniform, and went on this island, and before he got caught by the police, he killed 69 people on this island. Half of these people were, I think, 16 years or 18 years or younger. So it was a horrible massacre where he killed 69 completely innocent people on this island, and some people managed to escape by trying to hide or by swimming from the island. So and then he got caught, and now he's in prison. So that was 10 years ago. That was the attacks themselves, and my research is centered on what happened, the immediate aftermath of these attacks. I'm interested in the immediate reaction and this first month after the attacks, and then Charlotte will talk more about the period after, because it's almost impossible to underestimate the shock that this was for the Norwegian population. And of course, it was also world news. It was, of course, the bomb was immediately covered by the media, and then it took some time before the full scale of attacks on the island became public known. But the day after, it was the full scale of this got known, and then there was a period of complete shock. People didn't know what to think or do anything. But then what happened was quite interesting. That the attacks happened on a Friday, and then Saturday, Sunday, you had people start to gather more and more in public spaces, lighting candles, putting up flowers, and this grew and grew. And then on the Monday after these attacks, there was all over Norway these big mass gatherings where people gathered, and there were songs, speeches, and people wanted to show solidarity and for the dead and the injured, and also to kind of show strength and strength as a nation. A lot in these marches, this was the summer, often you have candles or like torches, but people had, because it was a summer, it was more fitting with flowers. And also, as in many European countries, a red rose is the symbol of the Labour Party, so people had red roses. So this was called the rose marches, these marches. And they became kind of emblematic for this response, and was seen as a clear symbol of how kind of the Norwegian people stood together and was able to counter, give a message against the ideology of the terrorists, etc. And this was the whole country for like about a month was completely dominated by this experience, but before kind of thing went back more to normal, and then many things have happened after that. But we'll talk more about this. So I find it, as Peter said, so I'm interested in how kind of collect meaning and social collective identity and these things are kind of created by groups of people. So for me, it's interesting to study this period because, in a sense, what happened in Norway is quite typical of the reaction to terrorist attacks. Of course, it's a shocking event, and then people typically rally around the flag, as one term is. People typically default to kind of the ideas about the nation, ideas about unity, and we know this, of course, from France, where we have had several terrorist attacks, and other countries, like, of course, like often when we see terrorist attacks, this is a quite typical response, what we also saw in Norway. But I would like to emphasize that in Norway, it was so unexpected, and then the collective reaction was also a lot more bigger and characterized by of course, as you know, security can be conceptualized in many ways, and you can have security, we need to keep the railroad system safe, or we need to talk about security like this. But what happened in Norway did kind of not only affect people's kind of superficial feeling of security, it was a societal and existential crisis. It really kind of blew up completely basic ideas about that people had in the Norwegian population. This happened was that, of course, people got really sad. 9 out of 10 people said they had a strong reaction of sadness. And the same amount of people is the key word in this first period. The first hours and days after the attacks was a period of unrealness. It was completely unreal, and people talk about of people who were the general population, but also political leaders. It was unreal in the sense that you couldn't comprehend it. It was unreal in the sense that people said, I can't talk about this. I don't even have words to talk about this. It was unreal in the sense that it was like time, many people talk, it was like time stopped, time came out of joint. And it was also unreal in the sense that people were like frozen. They couldn't, it was like, I don't even know what to think. I don't know what to feel. I don't even know what to do anymore, because this is not just something bad that has happened. This is like a completely different thing that I don't even know what this is. This is like a foreign, like a hole has been opened. This scale of evil, this type of evil. So just to repeat, 9 out of 10 Norwegians felt it was unreal. And for me, as a sociologist, I'm fascinated by what this really means. Of course, it's quite common to say when you experience a disaster, it's unreal. But why is it unreal? And how do we fix this unreality? How do we go from real to unreal and then back into a new kind of reality? This is one of the questions that preoccupies me, because it's for me, it points towards some of the key questions about trying to understand society. What is the core about these common conceptions we have about being together, living together, being safe, being able to do our business without having to worry about these things. And I won't go too much into that, but so when I try to understand this, I use the phenomenological tradition, especially the sociological versions of this, like Schutz, Berger, Luckmann, sociologists who has taken ideas from the phenomenological tradition in philosophy and applied it to sociological thinking. And the key idea in the sociological phenomenological tradition is this idea that that society and reality, in a sense, is not kind of like, it's not what's behind everything. It's not like Ding an sich, that as Kant. It's not like basic physical reality examined by physicists. But what is most real, what is real for people in society, is this common constructed social realities, language, ideas about who we are, what we stand for, what we can expect. And when something like a terrorist attack happens, it is such a breach with our basic expectation to what it means to be a person in a society that it becomes unreal. So this is something I focus on, and I think it's an idea that's interesting to take into account when we talk about security. Say, I heard in the intro that you had talked about the global warming and environmental security and insecurity, and of course it's a problem if global warming creates storms, if it creates hot weather, it gives a lot of concrete, troublesome effects. But in a sense, it's also an ontological insecurity. The fact that we as the human species is not able to deal with this in a proper way does also kind of create not only localized insecurities and security problems, but it does create kind of a global ontological insecurity about what type of reality is it that we live in at all, can be called into question. So I think, so one of my main focuses is in how this insecurity, this unrealness, was characterized by the first days after the attacks, which we can also see in many other attacks, just so that is said. And then my second question becomes, what did Norwegian changed into this strong need to go into the streets, to have these big marches. And the way I understand it, that was kind of a way to recreate security, or in a sense recreate the reality. And as you know, after terrorist attacks, you typically have these kind of mass gatherings, you have speeches from political leaders, you have all these things, you always see this. But again, I think Norway is kind of a prototypical case, because both the shock but also the response was so massive. And in Norway, we had these big so-called rose marches, and the biggest one was just outside my window in a public square in Oslo, and it was about 200,000 people that met in Oslo on this Monday after attacks, and that's probably the biggest gatherings of people anywhere in Norwegian history. There has never been before after such a big gathering of people in one place, and this was only in Oslo. We had this all over the country. And this is also interesting because it happened spontaneously. It was not something planned by the government. It happened on Facebook, social media, and then the police and the government and everybody collaborated to get this done. So on the one hand, we had this first shock, this first feeling of insecurity and sadness and unreality, and then we had these big gatherings, and I would describe them as kind of democracy rituals and national rituals, where people talked about this sense of coming together, how this was a beautiful, meaningful thing, and how people who participated in these big marches talked about how they kind of felt the love and the strength and the power in these gatherings. And after these gatherings, one of the biggest newspaper in Norway had a photo on the first page of this gathering in Oslo. And the headline was, "This was the day that Norwegians took Norway back." So this idea that we had kind of lost what it meant to be Norwegian, we had lost Norway, but by going into the streets, we kind of took it back. And there's a lot more to say about this. But as I said, I think I would describe this as kind of rituals that do kind of give back a sense of power and being the captain of one's own destiny after this was completely lost for a few days. And to understand this, I use the phenomenological tradition, but also ritual theory, going back to Emile Durkheim, the big French sociologist, and also modern thinkers like American cultural sociology, this person called Jeffrey Alexander, who has been a neo-Durkheimian. And the key insight into all this is this idea that collective identity, in this case national identity, a feeling of belonging, isn't something that we just have like by default. It is created by people coming together, by talking, singing, and by symbols like the flag, like these roses, and all this kind of ritualistic activity creates this kind of energy. And the way I see it, this is especially important after an attack like this, because when this basic ontological security is threatened, the need to come together and have this kind of mass gatherings is even more important, because one need to kind of repair and redefine what it means to be a collective. And I can just share one quote from a researcher called Jacob Eiermann, who's an American professor, also belonging to the same school as Jeffrey Alexander. And they have done a lot of research on what they call cultural trauma, exactly what you're talking about, how traumatic events both are threat to the social order, but also kind of opens up for the public and for researchers a possibility of insight and societal change. So writing about cultural trauma like a terrorist attack, this is what Eiermann writes in an article from 2012. So this is a quote: "Crisis reveal to a collective the grounds of its collective identity. Like individual trauma, a societal crisis is both a shock and an opportunity, revealing and making available for reflection what otherwise remains deeply hidden. At the collective level, such trauma can be inclusive as well as exclusive, and old collectivities can be reaffirmed as well as new ones created. So what he's saying is what I also was saying, that in a crisis situation, what is often tacit knowledge about who we are, what our values, what our symbols has to be made explicit. When the basic ideas about what a collective is and is based on is threatened, it's not longer enough just to have some vague ideas about who we are. It needs to be made explicit. And this was done in this Rose Marches. And the way it was done was that it was a national story about Norway. The big story, the big idea was that this attack has happened. Breivik, the terrorist, is a horrible person, he's an evil person, he's an ugly person. But in the long run, even though he did succeed in his terrorist acts, isolated, he did in the long run lose, because he kind of lost vis-a-vis the Norwegian people and the Norwegian nation, because the Norwegian nation had this ability to come together, show strength, and articulate our basic values like democracy, solidarity. This was interpreted as a sign that he lost and Norway won. And I think this, and of course this is a narrative, this is a story about something happened and an outcome. And I think this, again, this story is a typical national story. You see it again and again in all modern national states. In a crisis situation, this was a national response, but it was not like a right-wing nationalistic response. It was more like a left-center response. And unlike many articulation of national ideas and collectivity, this was kind of a soft articulation, in the sense that if you talk about the nation state, can have both stereotypical masculine and feminine sides. The masculine sides, again, talking stereotypically, the masculine sides being like strength, willingness to fight, while the soft feminine values being more solidarity, love, care. And there was a lot more talk about love, caring, the ability to show love, the ability to take care of each other. This was one of the kind of main messages after the terrorist attacks, but it was always framed within a nationalist or national story, that this was the prime virtues of the Norwegian people. The Norwegian people had a unique capability to express love, to express solidarity, to take care of the wounded and take care of each other. So this first attacks, it was a few days of complete feeling of unreality and helplessness that then moved into this big feeling of power and collective identity, with emphasis on this idea about Norway. The idea Norway was the main reference to Norwegian people, which as I said, is a common and well-known type of collective identity in modern nations, of course. But one of the paradoxes of these attacks was that it wasn't, at least from the terrorists' point of view, this wasn't an attack on Norway. It was, his goal was to save Norway. He was also a nationalist who liked Norway. But of course, he was a right-wing, anti-Muslim terrorist. So he didn't want to attack Norway. He wanted to keep like Muslims out of Norway and stuff like that. But he didn't attack Muslims either, because in his conspiracy worldview, the main culprit for the immigration of Muslims to Norway was the Labour Party. And just to remind you, what was in fact attacked was government building led by the Labour Party coalition and the Labour Party youth camp on this island. So it was, in a sense, even though the attack was seen as an attack of all of Norway, in another sense, it was an attack on an extremely specific and political group, this Labour Party and the Labour Party youth organization. So many things has happened in the 10 years that has gone since then, but one of the main things that happened the last year is that many people from the Labour Party felt that all these big Rose marches, all of these coming together was, most people think this was like good and fine. It was a good thing to do at the moment, and it was, everyone in Norway felt affected by this, so it was kind of impossible not to have these big mass gatherings. But in the long run, it did kind of depoliticize what actually happened and what was the motivation between the attacks. As I said, it was a specific political attack on one group. So there has been many examples of people from the Labour Party, people who was on the island and survived the attacks, being met with criticism and even harassment in the aftermath since this happened. Because they have said, well, we have to remember this was an attack not only on Norway, but also a political attack by a right-wing terrorist on our party, the Labour Party, and they have been met with responses. No, you're politicizing this, you're making this into like politics in a way you shouldn't. It was like a prime example of Norwegian unity, and the Rose marches was a prime example of the Norwegian people's capability to stand together as one. And if you now kind of start to discuss how it was an attack not on all of Norway, but just on your party, you are kind of creating division and politicizing this. So this has been a big debate just the last year, and there's also been many other debates that Charlotte will talk a bit about the memorial and stuff like this. So I don't know if I'm able to sum this up, but one way to sum it up would be something like this: that before the attacks, we had a period of stability, everyday life. It was normal summer holiday. Then we had this extremely shocking event that completely destabilized the whole social order and created a big sense of uncertainty and unease. Then this was, then we had this period of togetherness and a strong feeling of unity, standing together and kind of recreating our common identity and common reality. And then this has faded into everything afterwards. But there has been a lot of, where this unity has been marked by division and fights about many other things. And this is, and this Charlotte will talk more about this. I think I end there.
Wonderful, Tore. Thank you very much. I have 25 questions, but I'm going to save all of them and give the floor directly to Charlotte. Go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you, Tore. That was amazing. And I'm going to be building on a lot of what you said. Just going to share my screen. Okay, can you see that okay? Tore, I can see you. Put your thumb up if you can see it. Perfect.
Yes, it's good. Just launch the presentation.
Excellent. Sometimes my laptop crashes when I do that. So if it's okay to do it as it is in the current view, I'll do it like that. Yeah, my laptop is so old. Okay, it's a real pleasure to join you today to talk about this. It's been something I've researched for a while and have become absolutely fascinated with. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about physical memorials and why they're sometimes used to bring about security of who we think we are, but also sometimes explicit security policy. But I'll explain that when we get there. So bear with me. There we go. The structure of what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to introduce you a little bit to what a memorial is, a physical piece of architecture designed to commemorate an event, and how that's been thought about in the academic literature. And then I'm going to tie that to the story of what happened in Oslo and Utøya, a very interesting case where a memorial was chosen, several in fact, but the whole process had to be cancelled and restarted after multiple lawsuits. To my knowledge, this is, as far as I know, the only time this has happened. It's a very interesting case, and very prominent and well known. And then I'll conclude by sort of talking you through how this affects thinking about security and what this story can tell us about security, especially national security, and how it deals with the past, sometimes to think about the future. So to kick us off, what is a memorial? Well, honestly, it can be a lot of things. It doesn't have to be a physical object built by a state in a park or a square. It could be a spontaneous memorial, which the leaving of tributes and flowers where a horrible event has taken place. A memorial could be a personal tribute, or it can be national. So there are many different types of memorials. The ones I look at are primarily this permanent physical design that's put up in a city or where an event happened. But there are other types. There are digital memorials, there are temporary memorials. So this is a really broad field of research. What seems to unite them is that they're often associated with memory of sudden unexpected death, whether this is public or private. So the shock to the society, the shock to the family, the shock to the nation is what kind of connects all these different objects, be they flowers or a statue or a monument. So they're connected with shock, and shock at our own mortality, basically, and the deaths of others. Primarily, memorials have tended to be related to war, at least state memorials, and the ones that the state builds, but the remit is dramatically expanding. So we'll talk a little bit about terrorism memorials and how new this concept is in a second, because really this has not been a permanent feature of what a state does, to build a memorial after a terrorist attack. This is quite new in historical terms. So what is a memorial? So a lot of the literature connects this up with sort of previous eras of history where states have responded to civil wars or revolutions by building a lot of statues after the event finishes. So Erica Doss has written a lot about the Statuemania, which followed big historical events, particularly the American Civil War, but also the French Revolution, where just statues went up everywhere in most towns and cities. And she links this to what we're now experiencing for her, which is memorial mania. And she thinks this through in terms of, what does this monument mean? What does this statue mean? Why are states building these? To smooth over a shock, to smooth over a crisis, and to make it more balanced again, to bring about unity and to reconsolidate the idea of the nation after a crisis. So she thinks about monuments as icons, particularly icons of what the nation means in this historical era, and putting icons in public places to govern how people feel about the nation, to try and unite them around an idea of who they are collectively. And that, in a way, is a form of security. It's bringing about a shared sense of we, togetherness, solidarity, and thinking that through in terms of what the state gains from that. Now, of course, this doesn't always work. There's also a lot of literature on how these icons, these monuments that are supposed to bring about a sense of who we are and who the state thinks we should be, that often excludes a lot of people. So frequently, these are very contested political spaces. They attract very different visions of who we are and what should be told in this public narrative about the state, the country, the nation. One very key thing I have to tell you before we get to the story of Norway is the literature on how the memorial changed is very important. Primarily the work of James Young is very important here, which traces through how the memorial has changed. So in the past, it always used to be a statue, a figurative representation of a person usually. And this is a modernist style. Now this has changed, and if you think about the type of memorials we commonly see today, they're not figurative. They are much more abstract. They tend to be quite bleak, actually. Very dark marble is used a lot to try and communicate something else about who we are. We've moved away from the statue of a person. The image here is the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin. And you can see that this is very much not a statue. This is not an image of a person. This is not an image of glory. This is a very architecturally bleak and sparse reflection on horror. So there's been a huge shift in the type of aesthetics used. James Young has traced this through the many Holocaust memorials that are now present in many cities in Europe and around the world. And this tracks in with a change in what is memorialized. So rather than historic memorials, which are to the national glory, to this sanitized image of who we all are and what we should believe, now monuments do also address really complicated, problematic horrors of history, and they acknowledge them, and they acknowledge that horror with their new aesthetic. So a monument has changed recently in the 20th century. It's no longer just glorification. It's no longer a statue or an icon. It can be these much more complicated, postmodern, as some of the literature calls them, postmodern memorial that tries to bring the people together while acknowledging that there was a significant horror that is challenging and that we need to be unified in preventing that happening again. So this image here will become important later. This is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. You usually won't see this kind of image. You'll usually see a long marble wall with names of the dead soldiers engraved on it. You won't usually see it from this angle. Here at this angle, you can see what the designer was getting at. This is Maya Lin's design. This is a scar carved into the earth, into the Washington Mall. So the central site of US power. This is a scar, a black marble scar carved into the earth, to represent, the horror of what being drafted into that war that the US ended up losing. So it can't be a glorified statue of national strength. Instead, we have this scar cut into the landscape. This will become very important for the Norwegian case coming up. So the memorial is an attempt to bring unity to the US population, especially after that difficult war, which they ended up losing. The soldiers are not welcomed home. They're treated as baby killers in the initial years afterwards. So this design has to deal with a very complicated political context. Hence this design, it's a scar, it's an unhealable wound. And the attempt to bring national unity together around this wound and to not just glorify it with a statue. However, conservative forces hated it. They really despised the bleak postmodern style, if you will. And there's actually, they made a new memorial that sits alongside Maya Lin's design, and it is a statue, and it is a statue of soldiers. So this is a very politically contested site with different memorials doing different things. You have the statue honoring the figures of the soldiers as brave warriors against the backdrop of this unhealable wound in the American nation after this war. The best books on this, my favorites, are by Jenny Edkins and also Christine Sylvester. Bear with me as I just move the Zoom bar out of the way. There we go. And they both reflect on what the memorial is, what it does for politics and for security. Like, these are state-produced architecture. These are used for a reason, and they reflect a particular representation of the past and will be governed. So even if they address horrible subjects like torture, terrorism, genocide, they are still political objects with an intended function. Christine's book is wonderful in tracking how everyday people change their meaning. So if this is a topic you want to engage with, these are the best books. Okay, terrorism memorials. Before the 1990s, you would not see a memorial to a terrorist attack, not a monument anyway, not a big design. So on the image, we have the reflecting absence pools in New York, enormous scale, black marble again, enormous design occupying a city block. Before the 1990s, most often there would be a small plaque on the site of an attack. I've actually, whenever I go to a British city, I tend to try and find the terrorism plaque, because there's been attacks in most British cities, and it's always really hard to find. Small little plaque. The one to the Birmingham bombings, where around 30 people died, tiny little plaque in the cathedral. So this kind of current world that you live in, with these giant monuments to terrorist attacks and the memory of people who died in them, it's a very new phenomenon. People have looked into this to understand why this has happened all over the world. And they are suggesting that the end of the Cold War is a feature here, because before the 1990s, terrorist attacks were not on a scale of sort of international political concern or awareness, such that you had to have a mega memorial. So they're saying that the shift in global politics to this new enemy, this dispersed terrorist enemy, this is the new global security phenomenon, the new thing occupying the minds of policymakers. And if this is the new world we live in, then the scale with which we respond after an attack gets a lot bigger. So memorials reflect security and security concerns. Particularly as well, they're not always about the past, they're about the future. So my favorite examples of this, how can a memorial be about securing the future? Well, the EU has a radicalization awareness network. It's this enormous platform for all EU countries. One of its working groups is on victims and memorials. Now, they understand the memorial as a device that secures the future. How? This is a very strange use of time and temporality. The way they understand it, if the memorial is good enough, if it does its job, then people will feel the pain of victims, they'll feel properly immersed in the nation's values, and they won't commit a terrorist attack. So this is the logic of the EU work around this. The memorial doesn't just heal the past, it also prevents the future attack by governing people in a way of being that they will feel part of the nation, they'll understand the pain of victims, and they will not be radicalized. So here we see the bending of temporality very strongly. Also, in many countries, memorials have an explicit security function in that they bring calm and unity after a shock. And this is like the last stage in sort of recovery in a lot of these policies. If the memorial works, it brings resilience, it brings people together. The event has ended at that point. The disruption of the attack ends when people feel rebonded, reconfident of the nation. So these are strange ideas, but they are there in security policies. So strange that I decided to spend my life studying them. Okay. Now, I promised you the story of Norway and the memorial saga in Norway. I'm building on Tore's presentation of the shock and what the attempt was to end that shock by the state with physical architecture. So as Tore showed us, Breivik's attacks caused massive societal shock in Norway. He's talked us through the rose marches and the demonstrations of who we are and who we want to be and bringing society back together. So from 2012 roughly through to about 2019, I've been sort of reading the documents surrounding the memorial process, but also visiting frequently to interview people who work on Utøya Island and who are responsible for the memorial there, interviewing people attempting to build memorials in Oslo and opposite Utøya, and also opponents of the memorial plans. So a lot of interviews. There was a large effort to bring about 2 national memorials to the attacks, and they were cancelled. They had to be cancelled after significant opposition from certain resident communities, as well as popular opinion in some early cases. So there's a real saga and story here about whose memorial and who protests it and who doesn't want it, whose vision of security and unity is this not. This is the memorial that is currently on Utøya Island. As Tore explained, it's privately owned by the Labour Youth Party, and they have dedicated, this memorial to their dead, to the 69 youth who died there. So this is going to be a strong part of the story, that this memorial exists, and it exists on the privately owned island. The very first step in the story is not long after the attacks. The government undertakes a survey of how they want to memorialize them. This is called the Cleveland Report. And it recommends that the Oslo Memorial is built in Castle Park, which is over 1 kilometer from the government quarter. If you walk it, it's longer, but as the crow flies, it's kind of 1 kilometer. So they want a memorial not where the bomb went off, but over 1 kilometer away. This is the first step in an idea about what a memorial should be being thrown out by the public. So the public, at this point in 2011, they've seen what's happened in Spain with the attacks in Madrid. They've seen what happened in New York and the memorial built in the World Trade Center. And it makes very little sense to the public in Norway that the memorial to the Oslo bomb would be 1 kilometer away from where it actually happened. They've seen what's happened elsewhere in the world, and they understand that drive in the architecture, that it happens on the site as close as possible to where people were killed, to where the shock resonated from. They've seen this internationally, and it doesn't make any sense to them for a memorial to be 1 kilometer away. There's a lot of work on why memorials now are built on the site of horror, sociological work, primarily by Kenneth Foote, that these monuments, they deal with the horror of the site. And they're often built on the site to do sanctification. So this is Kenneth Foote's term, but removing the horror from the site, resolving the site so that it can move forward and mean commemoration and unity. So first of all, the Cleveland Report was going to pull down the government tower that Tore spoke of. This is called Høyblokker. It's in the picture here. The plan was, this is a very old brutalist concrete architecture structure. It's not very pretty. The plan was to pull it down to modernize the government quarter. This had to be abandoned because the public were completely opposed to this. The site had become so special, so resonant with the memory of what had happened there, that the narrative was put forward: if we pull down this building, the terrorist wins. This is what he wanted to do. He wanted the building to fall. We can't complete his plans. You cannot pull down this building. And so this idea had to be cancelled. Høyblokker still stands. There's a temporary exhibit in the basement. It's very good. I recommend you go and see it. However, this continues to be an issue to this day because the surrounding buildings, E-Blokker, are going to be pulled down, might even have been pulled down now by this point. there's now a huge lawsuit going on because they contain Picasso artwork blasted into the wall. And people are saying, you can't just tear these government buildings down. What about the artwork? What does that mean? So there's a lawsuit going on about that currently, and the plans to take the artwork down and put it in museums instead. So this is a hugely contested site. What's even more contested is the planned national memorial associated with Utøya Island. Now, remember what I told you earlier. The island is privately owned and it has a memorial on it built by the IUF for the people who died there. The families can visit. There is a memorial. So the national plans had to accept that, and they decided to place the national memorial across the water on the Solbråten Peninsula, across the water. It overlooks the island. And look at this design. Look at this. This is an artist's picture of what it might look like because it was never built. It cuts a gash in the landscape to represent the unspeakable horror of what happened on the island. This is Jonas Dahlberg's memory wound design. It won the competition. The Norwegian Arts Council, KORO, were extremely excited about it when I spoke to them around 2014 when it was selected. I think that was the right year. They were so excited about this design and how it encapsulates the horror of that day. It doesn't try to resolve it. It can never be resolved by those who remember it, but instead unity is brought back around this memorial, around this horror. However, it's never built. Local residents in the area hated it, really hated it. Initially, they called it a postmodern art project and they hated the design. But since they started their lawsuit against the government, they've reframed this around the trauma it would cause them for buses of tourists to come to visit this memorial. So this has never been built. Yeah, the whole process is cancelled, both the National Memorial in Oslo, but also at Solbråten, and it has to be started again with a new idea. So why, if there is already a memorial on the island that the families can visit, the IUF run a ferry, and if you have a good reason to go, then they will use the ferry to bring you across to the island if you're a survivor, if you're a family member, or if you're a researcher. So I've been several times because I needed to speak to the stakeholders on the island. The ferry is captained by a man who lost his wife in the attacks, so it's a very emotionally poignant journey, you know, to meet him. So why does the state need to do this? If there's already a memorial that the family and the victims and the survivors can visit, why does the state push so hard, even against multiple lawsuits, to have its own national memorial? Who is that for? If the victims, the families and the survivors and the Labour Youth Party have their own memorial, who is the national design for? It's for a wider audience. It's for the nation, and it is for the state to govern the traumatic aftershocks of what that attack did. It is very much a national political object, rather than something for the families or the victims. So at my last visit, Høyblokke still stands, the big tower, and there's this glass memorial with the names of people who died in the plaza. To try and resolve the lawsuit issue and the cancellation of the national memorials, the Labour Youth Party said, okay, use our jetty, use where the ferry crosses to the island. You can build your national memorial there, okay? Do not please make the victims and the survivors go to court to argue this out. Please don't do this to them. Use our jetty. It looked like that might work, but there's now another legal challenge from the local residents saying, we do not want this in our area. You know, we remember that day. We went out on boats to fish the survivors out of the water. We were shot at. We don't need anything to help us remember. We remember very well, thank you very much, what happened on that day. This is their narrative that I got through speaking to them. So this is a very contested process with legal processes still ongoing about what can be built where. No one is appropriately placed to say who is right or who is wrong. What we can look at is, what does this mean about memorials? What does this mean about how we think about security? So these arguments are coming from many more case studies as well, in the US, Spain, UK, but also in Bali. Governments, as we've seen, have moved towards big post-terrorist monuments, and they really often try to build them on the site. So most of these memorials are built on the site as close as possible, and that's meaningful. They're built on the site to obtain site authenticity, in the words of someone from the 9/11 Memorial Museum. And what this means is that the public space is associated with this horror, this shock, this demolition of any certainty we had about life. And if you build the memorial there, you can rescript the site around a different narrative, around heroes, first responders who ran in, around unity, around resilience. So memorials do something. They govern our feelings, okay? They effectively govern. They try to bring about resilience and unity after a shock, after a disaster, even when private memorials already exist on the site. So the state's drive is so powerful that it can ignore the fact that there already is a private memorial. So I had to think about this across multiple case studies in multiple countries, and it sort of led me to argue a lot through sort of Heidegger in some ways, that why is the state so obsessed with doing this? Why will it drive to the point of lawsuits to get as close to the site as possible to build an object? Why do that? Because death makes us feel so insecure. Sudden, unexpected death is the most powerful emotion that we can be exposed to. And it's also difficult for the state that has to control, has to govern. Death is very disruptive. Shock is very disruptive, especially if you're a modern state and you're secular. So in countries that are still have a public religion that's very powerful, like Indonesia, where I did one of the case studies, there's less drive to memorialize. There's less drive to do this. The rituals are already in place to process death and shock. But the modern state seems particularly driven to build an object to try and control that space where the memory of death and shock is still very, very present. And so this chimes with Kenneth Foot's work on sanctification and what the object does to cleanse the site of those memories. If that's not the case, why do all the states want the site itself, even incredibly difficult sites to memorialize, like the Pentagon? The Pentagon has an enormous memorial space built there as well. It's so difficult to get to. You have to go through military security to visit this memorial at the Pentagon. It's so difficult to get to. It's under a flight path. It's next to a freeway. It's horrible. It's the worst possible site to build a tribute. So why do it? Because the governments feel the need to control that space and to take it back and to control all that feeling of shock. So this is how it's a security response. It's to combat a danger that still lingers on the site and in memory, the ever-present sort of echo of what happened. And then sometimes explicitly for the EU and for national security strategies, these objects also secure the future. Because if you bring people back into the national unity, the idea is that they won't radicalize. Finally, why you might think of a memorial as a security object, remember the history and how before the 1990s, we didn't do this. We built little plaques on the side of walls, at the side of buildings. It's only when international security became obsessed with terrorism as the major threat, the major insecurity, it's only then that memorials took on this scale and became this common to terrorist attacks and became this sort of powerful. So the argument is that these are objects that do things, or at least the state attempts to do things with a memorial. Of course, they're heavily contested, and Norway shows lawsuits can become very common, public protests can become very common, family protests can become very common in many of these sites, because in the words of a book on the shelf behind me by Jay Aronson, who owns the dead? So if the state is driving so hard to control the memory of your loved one who you lost in one of these attacks, this can generate a lot of feelings of, hang on a minute, this isn't your person, this is my person that I lost. You don't own their memory. So it's a very political process. And I'll stop there and attempt to stop sharing my screen, which usually takes me a moment to work out. There we go.
I can start talking while you're stopping sharing. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Charlotte. Thank you again, Tora. Really wonderful and very, very complimentary talks. We didn't do too much planning about the complementarity, but it's definitely there. The floor is open. La parole est à vous. I can start by launching, I can start with a question or two myself. There's so many, maybe one to each of you. Tora, I thought what was most appealing to me about your talk was the bit about rituals and myth. Yeah, you don't use the word myth. Maybe that's part of the question. You talk about rituals, democracy rituals. So that the Rose, how did you call it? The Rose demonstration. That's what I call it. It was a ritual march. The Rose March. Thank you. The Rose March was a ritual of democracy. So it's what made democracy be itself in some sense. And I wonder, since we're talking with a French audience, where democracy is extremely formalized, and indeed political thinking is very formalized and very, in my opinion, I wonder what my French students would say to this, but in my opinion, very little ritualized, that it's very on paper, to put it that way. It's very formal. I wonder if that argument could be made everywhere, universally, or if it's only in societies where where, like the British or the Scandinavian, you have more of a common law organization where traditions and customs play a larger role in organizing society and legitimating governments. So that's a big open question to you, and then I could launch an equally big and open question to Charlotte, maybe, to be fair, to be equal. A beautiful line from your talk was that the destruction continues forward. So the bomb goes off and the destruction doesn't stop, and it keeps going 10 years along, which really very, very evocative idea, and I think you're absolutely right. But what comes to my mind is the question, does the memorial accelerate the healing, or does it stand in the way of the healing? Does it have any relationship to the healing? Does your research show that it's actually a plaster on the destruction that's continuing, or is it just a way of sort of taking a snapshot of to capture the horror, as you call the postmodern kinds of monuments? So there's one question among the many possible questions, and for you others, please raise your hand and intervene as you like in whatever language you please.
Okay, thank you so much. Should I respond? And thank you for the question. Thank you so much, Charlotte, for a very interesting talk. You raised these keywords, democracy, ritual, and myth, that I didn't use it in my talk, but I completely see that as a relevant word to use, because as I think Charles also demonstrated in secular Western societies, if we have a new cosmological and collective dimension, it's often the state who at least provides or tries to provide that to an extent. And then, especially in crisis, I completely agree with this idea that that death, especially a violent death, uncontrolled, like in a terrorist attack, signifies the most potential threat to the symbolic and social order. So it's extremely important to integrate and control that insecurity. And of course, the typical nation-state way of doing it is by emphasizing the state will go on, the people will go on, we are still in the master of our own faith, etc. And so this is, I think, what fascinates me about this idea about the nation, France, Norway, England, the US, and also democracy. France, Norway, US, England, we are all democracy. So the nation and the democracy is in a sense international and generic, but of course it has to be Norwegian democracy, a Norwegian state that is actualized. So it's both particular and general. So in my research that goes into a lot of course, into details, I try to kind of spell out exactly what Norwegian myths are used to create Norway in such a situation. And of course, I won't go into that now, but of course, Norway has a special cultural repertoire of myths, of stories about what it means to be Norwegian, and these are both used and also recreated, because in Norway, remember, this was Norwegian attacking Norway, and it was a kind of anti-multiculturalist. So in Norway, it was the messages in the Rose marches was very traditional, like Norwegian. We are Norway, Norway is strong, and we will triumph like we have done before. But of course, it was also kind of new ideas about this is the new Norway, this is the new multicolored Norway, this is also who we are now. So of course, you will have this type of tensions. So, and then you can, and as the quote from this Jacob Eiermann, I think a crisis can both reuse old ideas about who we are, but also it is because it's a shock, because what is tacit has to be articulated, it can also be re-articulated. So it is a possibility to create new types of collective identity. And so that was one response. And I would also like to just say something about this, about rituals, because there are two ways of thinking about democracy as a set of kind of modern rational rules, modern law, modern bureaucracy, modern political systems that are completely non-ritualized. And this is kind of the everyday going on about the state bureaucracy, the political system. So for me, and for many people, and I think this is both normal people and a lot of academians have this rationalist bias and think this is what it is and this is how it should be. And like any kind of irrational mixing in of myth, religion, rituals is a perversion of rational Western democracy. But and I think this is one important aspect, especially in the everyday life, that we need this rationalist functioning democracies. But especially in a crisis, it is not enough. So then democracy, which most of the time is just rules about conduct and how we elect our leaders. But in a crisis, because we don't have a God in the nation state, this is like kind of what is the core belief. So then that becomes the center of a ritualistic focus. For example, at these big Rose marches, the Prime Minister of Norway, like his main message was, he spoke to 200,000 people, and also, of course, the television. He said, more openness, more democracy. This is us. This is Norway. That was one of the main messages that, like, so many people also agreed with. But of course, at the same time, this first month after the attacks, to make this ritualistic, this democracy ritual possible at all, people had to kind of come together and put normal division to the side. So political debate, media debate, all this was suppressed so that we could stand as one. And of course, open debate among politicians, among media, is also an integral part of democracy. So in a sense, there was a real tension between the ritualistic aspect of democracy and the more kind of everyday rational approaches. So, but still, so there are a lot of paradoxes and tensions. But I think, and I'm heavily influenced by this American cultural sociological tradition, I think if you miss this performative, ritualistic, mythological aspects of politics, you do lose a significant element also.
That was going to be exactly the last question I wanted to push on you, whether it's a requirement of democracy. I'm sorry for switching off my camera. It's only because the bandwidth where I am is so bad that I save it. Charlotte, do you want to comment on this question too, or?
Oh, I have a response to the question asked of me while my cat destroys the room behind me, which I think was caught on camera. Yeah, he's not the
charming,
smoothest of cats. He's quite clumsy. So does the memorial accelerate or hinder the healing? This is a good question. I think a lot plays out through the memorial process. Really? Is this really happening? Okay. So if we think of the memorial as a process of planning, of a competition to see which design will work, the idea of the judges and the process, and then sometimes the cancellation of the whole process to start again, that this is actually a window onto what's really happening in the society and in sort of playing out this healing. Who gets to represent the past? Is it the families? Is it an artist? Is it the residents? So the whole process of healing and still, it being very close in time to the events, the process of not healing is played out through this process as well. In one way, I think, the memorial can do its job in terms of resolving the place where something happened. It clears away the destruction. It can re-narrate through architecture what that place is supposed to mean for everyday visitors, for people who work there. But of course, this makes absolutely no sense outside the Western tradition. So to bring this into context, one of the case studies in the research was from Bali. The Bali bomb was one of the major attacks after 9/11. And Bali is a Hindu particular variant of Hinduism, but it's a very religious and society with lots of rituals that take up the everyday. And so there was a really interesting saga after the Bali bomb, which occurred in a nightclub in the Kuta district of the island, where lots of Australian tourists go, and lots of Australian tourists died in the attack. But also lots of Balinese died in the attack. So what do you do with these conflicting memorial cultures? Well, the government was sort of forced into building a memorial by the Australians because it fit with their expected understandings of grieving and resolving and healing, that there would be a physical monument where people could leave tributes on anniversaries. Now, this made very little sense to the locals who have very different traditions of how to heal. So if you've ever been to Bali, you'll notice the little sort of flowers in little wicker, almost baskets, but it's very small, on the floor everywhere you go. And you almost step on them because they are everywhere. And so I had to sort of look into what is this? This is placing tributes to appease the spirits. Bali has fascinating traditions, including a day of silence each year where everybody has to hide like a lockdown in their house from the evil spirits one day a year. And if you make any noise, they'll find you. So this is part of their sort of animist tradition that after a major catastrophe or a lot of death, tributes are the way that you deal with the evil that remains and appease the people who died so that they're happy and they can move on. So they don't need a physical object at all, like an architecture. This is done because past, present, and future are all intersecting in a different way than they do in the West. The spirits are still there. They still require things from us, little tributes, and completely different understandings of death, not being permanent, but being reincarnation based. So when we talk about, does the memorial make healing happen? Does it hinder it? There's also this question of who for and whose rituals are represented in it. And yeah, I had a fascinating time sort of talking this through with the locals who had lost people and who really did not understand the Australian desire for a physical monument. It made no sense to them, but they wanted to make their guests happy. So they said, okay, fine, build the monument, but it is not a place where the locals go to find healing. It's very much a Western understanding of place and time and death and mortality. So I'll stop there.
Could I jump in with a couple of comments to Charlotte? Because it's really interesting what you're saying and also your talk. And I think both these are how to cleanse and respond to sites of death, and also this idea about a monument being open healing or keeping the wounds open are so interesting key questions, and I think they're being played out in so many different ways. In the Norwegian case, and I've written about this also, that there was a real tension between two stories about this idea about what happened was horrible, but kind of we won because we kind of came together, and now we can move on. And this other narrative about now we need to keep the wounds open and never forget. So I talked to people working at the 22nd of July Center, and they had like kids. They don't know that much about it, but the ending was good, kind of. So it was a fight, like it was bad. Oh, it was so sad what happened, but luckily it went well. But of course, these people that want to talk about the political aspects say, no, this is not an ended story. The story goes on. He was one of many right-wing terrorists, and this threat is still with us, and this fight is still going on. So this, I think this about closing a place and a story and keeping it open is such an interesting dichotomy. And of course, as you said, in the Vietnam Memorial and also the proposed Norwegian Memorial, it is literally a wound. It's supposed to be something you can never fully integrate into and understand fully. But and this other point, but of course there is this tendency to I think it's a quite deep human need, both on a individual and societal level, to cleanse the site of death and other things. And of course, I think it's really interesting about how you contrast this Western idea where we had kind of a secular nation state, but that still have this new role as a cosmological security provider, and this traditional religious societies that still has the old kind of tools, religious tools to do the same things. But I think this idea about cleansing a site, an event, this is something we see in almost all religions. And thinking about the work of Mary Douglas about pollution and the impure, I think it is, of course, the state wants to do it in its own way, but I think you see this in so many contexts, this idea that if something bad has happened, it needs to be kind of cleansed so that it can be reintegrated into the social order. And I would like to have, I will just say one more thing, because we have talked about different aspects of the terrorist attacks in Norway, but of course one aspect was that we had this bomb. It killed 8 people in Oslo, but it wounded hundreds. And not only did it wound people, but it kind of wounded the city of Oslo. It was completely unsafe. People were panicking. It was not a place of security, but insecurity. And it was also a place with a lot of noise from people who were afraid, and of course the noise from the bomb. It was a place with foul smell from the bomb. It was a place of chaos. It was a place of shattered building and glass. And Oslo, the main city, and this happened the bomb happened exactly in the center of Oslo, and the whole city had to be closed off and it had to be militarized. So we did kind of lose the whole city. But as soon as things opened up, people kind of flocked back into the city and started to kind of make it pretty, putting down candles, flowers, and then one of the first things the municipal leader of Oslo did was kind of slowly walk through the city to reclaim it in a way. And then these big rose marches was also talked about reclaiming the city. The rose marches happened close to the bomb site, quite close. So in a city that had been polluted and made unsafe, and not only unsafe but also ugly and evil, people came, and by singing, by making candles and flowers, they made it not only safe, but they made it beautiful. They made it a place of human collectivity again. And a lot of the way people talked about this was reclaiming the city, and they used this type of language as a ritual cleansing almost of a site that had been polluted and made ugly. But of course, this was not state initiative. This was a public, spontaneous example of another type of cleansing of a site. That is a quite, I wanted to mention it, because it's a quite interesting contrast to the kind of more state initiative monument cleansing that signifies other things. So I just want to say that also.
Thank you very much. I actually just got a message from Sybille Fonrouge, who suggests a book that she admires by Gainsbourger and Lefranc, which is called À quoi servent les politiques de mémoire? What are memorial policies good for? So that we can add to the bibliography, and then we can thank Mark Weltman, who puts in the chat, who notes that there are also invisible monuments, like the one in Saarbrücken, right across the border from in Germany, where there's a memorial to a hidden memorial to Jewish cemeteries. There's a Wikipedia article that's in English. It does not say, the article which I just read, it does not say whether the memorial was hidden on purpose or otherwise. I can have my suspicions that it was. And then it was revealed there was a class project, an architecture project, where the professor and the students renamed the place of invisible memorials. And now the square is actually called that with the sign on the wall. So thanks for that comment. Anything else? Alexis, je t'en prie, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, you both said the importance to publicly explicit values and how common values might also reduce the risk of terrorism. And well, I was wondering if you might develop again, how it might reduce risk, and how to estimate the level of values, and if you have some tools to recommend to young researchers.
Sure. Yeah, this is a particular idea of an EU working group and some papers they produced on this issue, that the memorial, which fundamentally looks at the past, can actually help build security for the future. I find this idea quite strange. It's not one I'm sure I agree with, and the reason I'm a bit worried about it is that it connects this idea of security, or let me start again, it connects this idea of insecurity to people who don't share our values, and that if only we could fix their problematic values, then we'll all be safe. I find it quite dangerous, that idea, because there are now a lot of policies that have a very racialized impact across Europe, where people are framed as dangerous and risky people because they don't share our values. And who gets to define that? The state. And quite a lot of countries are really struggling at the moment with how to do their counter-radicalization, the CBE. Some try to move away from this sort of racialized framing of difference as dangerous. Others explicitly say, no, we're happy with this idea. We're happy that terrorism is a problem of, you know, minorities that don't look or think like the rest of us. And I find that very worrying about the level of insecurity that idea will produce. You know, if a state policy does that, I get worried. So, you know, to come back to the question, yeah, the EU has a working group where they think that the memorial will make us safer because it will make people empathize with victims and be less likely somehow to commit terrorist attacks. Of course, this has never been tested, and it clearly wouldn't work even if it was tested. But it's a discourse that's out there in the minds of the policymakers, that if only we could make people all share our values and feel that other people are equally valuable, then everything will be okay. Yeah, it can come with some unintended consequences that I worry about in terms of that framing of difference being a problem.
Thank you. Alexis, I'll add the link to this EU working paper to the bibliography. Jan Golan, go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you a lot for this very interesting presentations. One of the things I found really interesting was both in the analysis of these marches, but also to a certain extent in the narratives of the memorials, the idea that it is a way to answer the attacker's narrative and in some sort of dialogue, which brought me a bit to the tensions in terms of scale of the social and political response in the dialogues that I had the impression was present in both presentations. Because Breivik did, of course, attack national institutions, as I said, but his manifest situates his attacks also in a global struggle against Islam and so-called cultural Marxism. And other terrorist attacks try to convey the same narrative you mentioned in the New Zealand attacks. What seems striking to me is that the social and political answer in this dialogue, both in terms of ritual and in terms of memorial, are or decidedly local, as I said, the conflict between the local memorial, the site, or they're decidedly national. The transnational dimension only seems to appear in the form of potential tourists visiting the sites. And if I think, for example, of the French attacks and the answers of it, both internationally and locally, often was also framed very nationally. People were in solidarity with France, even used the flag or the symbols like the Eiffel Tower, even though a lot of the victims did not necessarily come from France. If you think about the Nice attacks, for example. So what to make out of this insistence on the national as the dominant scale in memory of those attacks and memory of the death?
Very, very good question. Thank you. Go ahead, Ture, and Charlotte, I think afterwards.
It's a really interesting question, a really big question. I don't think I can fully answer it, but it is, for me, I was a bit surprised how because we do live in like the 21st century, but you often talk about like globalization and the weakening of the state, but I'm often surprised by how kind of in a crisis situation, how the state is the main collective identity that is being mobilized, because while there are of course many different ways of talking about this, and I do discuss this a bit in my research, but as you said with Breivik, of course his narrative is his narrative. That's a whole other issue, but it was, if we put it another way, of course his attack can be interpreted as an attack on maybe like global human dignity on Norway, but also of course on the Labour Party and the Labour movement, and also of course on individual people, just families. And so who owns the dead, as you said, is a good question, because of course when the emphasis becomes on the state or not on the state but on the nation, of course other things get left out. And this is the big debate we have had now the last year, because okay, if this was just like one guy attacking Norway and he lost, then it's fine. But if he's one of many right-wing people that exists also in other countries and also attacks kind of values, international values that exist in other countries, and he didn't attack Norway first and foremost, but he attacked maybe the labor movement, which of course is international. The story changes drastically, and all these components interlock. So for the people who kind of saw this first and foremost of an attack on Norway, they tended to see Breivik. They didn't depoliticize him, but they saw him as kind of a guy who just hated democracy, full stop. But while the people who kind of want to say, no, this was something more, it wasn't just an attack on Norway, it was an attack on Muslims, on the left. They want to problematize, but and go more into detail in in his story about this. So I think your comment is really good, and it's a key question. And for me, again, as a cultural sociologist, it just goes to show that, of course, all these responses, all this, what we think and feel about this, is always a product of negotiated and often full of tension, different stories, different ideas that can always be challenged, and will always push other interpretations to the side. So I think that.
That's a great answer. Great answer. It's such a good question as well. The first thing that came to my mind was the different body count for the 9/11 attacks. So there are NGOs who deal with families who lost people who died in the towers, but who did not have paperwork. So there's all this intense fear about what happens if they come forward for victim compensation because they're in the country without paperwork. And so there are actually different death tallies depending on if the migrant workers without papers who worked in the restaurants and behind the scenes in the towers, if you count them, the number goes up by about 80, I think, from memory. So in the official death counts, there is huge variation depending on how you count and who is counted. It also came to mind that one of the bridge attacks in London, I think nearly everybody was a tourist. So, the attacks take place on these, usually at sites of national importance or symbolism. So they, in one way, target the nation state and its symbols. And yet, because it's a national symbol, most of the people there are often tourists. And so who gets caught up? Way it's, that never plays out in Memorial itself, because the Memorial as a state enterprise, so just the sort of national response, it likes to reify the nation, and so this always tends to get left out. A lot of tourists or are without papers and sort of working in the grey economy, and who counts them, who represents them, they often will just be left out. I think Tore's answer was fantastic, so I'm just going to piggyback on Tore's answer.
Very good, thanks. Instead of trying to beat the question or the comment with a better one or a better answer, I think we'll just round it off right there and say, I'll try my camera again. There was just a drop in bandwidth. Say thank you very, very much to Tore and Charlotte. It's really a lovely talk. Thank you for the great comments too. The 3 or 4 comments were all very, very important. So there you have it. Thanks again. Have a nice holiday if you're taking one, and if not, we'll see you in 2 weeks' time.
Bye, everybody. Thank you. Bye.